Why Paradise by Force Always Ends in Chains. Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive series. In Roland Baader's Kreide für den Wolf, Chalk for the Wolf, we're unpacking the kind of bold thinking that cuts through decades of comfortable myths about how societies really work. This first part zeroes in on the intellectual foundations, tracing how certain overconfident ideas about reason and control planted the seeds for so much trouble. We'll move through those roots step by step, keeping things straightforward and logical so you can see exactly where the cracks appear and why they matter right now. Picture this for a moment. Imagine someone stepping up in a major legislative body and flat out refusing every bit of government handout coming their way. No subsidies, no welfare checks, no child benefits, no maternity support, nothing. They declare personal responsibility for themselves and their family, calling the whole system of forced redistribution what it truly is: institutionalized theft from productive individuals to feed an ever-growing apparatus of dependency. It's a radical move that stops everyone in their tracks because it exposes the coercion at the heart of it all. That single act isn't just symbolic. It forces you to confront whether the state has any legitimate claim to your earnings beyond the bare minimum needed for basic order. Logically, if property rights mean anything, then taking from one person by force to give to another without consent isn't compassion. It's plunder dressed up as morality. Any counter that tries to justify it by saying, society owes people a safety net crumbles when you ask who exactly society is and why that entity gets to decide your obligations at gunpoint. The reasoning holds because voluntary charity builds real community while coerced transfers breed resentment and moral hazard, where people game the system instead of creating value. If this hits you deep, those raw historical truths or those light bulb moments, drop a comment, tell a friend, and stick around for more. From there, the book levels a stark warning that what many thought was a decisive victory over certain ideologies back around 1989 and 1990 was nothing more than an illusion. Marxism didn't truly collapse. It simply slipped into new disguises, ready to re-emerge stronger if we don't stay vigilant. The danger lies in failing to recognize the deeper patterns, especially when they link up with things like massive debt bubbles that threaten to unravel everything. This isn't alarmism, it's pattern recognition. If you think the threat vanished because some regimes fell, consider how the same core assumptions about central control and engineered equality keep popping up under different labels. Counterarguments claiming that was just a historical aberration miss the point because the underlying logic of collectivist planning never changed. It just adapted. Sheer reason shows that any system promising paradise through top-down force will keep resurfacing until we uproot the intellectual errors that sustain it. Now we get to the heart of the intellectual roots, the fatal overreach of abstract reason itself, what the book calls the Cartesian trap. At its core, this is the hubris of believing that human minds can sit outside society like engineers at a drafting table and redesign complex social orders from scratch using pure logic and blueprints. It's constructivism at its most seductive and dangerous, treating evolved institutions, traditions, and spontaneous orders as obsolete clutter to be swept away for a rational master plan. Logically, this can't work because the knowledge required to coordinate millions of individuals isn't centralized in any one head or committee. It's dispersed in the daily choices, local insights, and trial-and-error experiments of countless people. Any attempt to impose a grand design ignores that reality and replaces it with the planner's limited, abstract model, which always distorts and destroys more than it builds. Counters that defend planning by pointing to successful government programs fall apart under scrutiny because they cherry-pick short-term wins while ignoring the unseen costs, the stifled innovation, and the long-term rigidity that turns dynamic systems into brittle failures. The reasoning is ironclad. Complexity demands humility, not hubris. That overconfidence blooms into what the author describes as the Dictatorship of Paradise, a relentless drive to force an earthly utopia through the state's absolute power, collective will, and the false merging of individual and group freedom. When reason claims it can engineer perfect harmony, the next step is declaring any dissent or organic friction as an obstacle to be crushed. Popular sovereignty gets twisted into a blank check for whatever the planners deem necessary, and suddenly you're living under the tyranny of good intentions. Pure logic dismantles the counter that we just need better leaders or smarter designs, because the problem isn't personnel. It's the premise that such total control is even possible without violating human limits and incentives. History's pattern of these experiments shows they don't evolve into freedom. They harden into coercion because power once granted for noble ends never willingly shrinks back. This ties directly into the darker currents within the broader Enlightenment project. While reason brought real gains in science and technology, its hyper-rationalist strain rejected evolved rules, practical knowledge, and the slow accumulation of cultural wisdom in favor of abstract blueprints. The result was a philosophical rupture that treated tradition as superstition and spontaneous development as chaos. The most explosive expression came in the form of that violent break known as the Luciferian Revolution, where the abstract ideals of total redesign were unleashed with fire and blood, shattering organic growth in the name of a new order. Reason here shows why this wasn't progress but regression. Revolutions born of constructivist fever always prioritize the ideal over the real, leading to terror when reality refuses to conform. Opposing views that romanticize such upheavals as necessary for liberty ignore the logical outcome. Once you reject incremental evolution for wholesale reinvention, the only tool left is force, and force has no off switch. Human beings don't live as pure rational calculators or instinct-driven animals. We sit in that tense space between the two. Over-relying on abstract reason, the so-called fatal conceit, blinds us to the severe limits of what any individual or group can truly know or control. Evolved rules, customs, and traditions aren't arbitrary. They're the accumulated solutions to problems we can't even fully articulate. Dismissing them in favor of top-down reason isn't enlightenment. It's arrogance that leaves society vulnerable to the very chaos it claims to prevent. Any counter-claiming we can transcend these limits through education or technology collapses because it assumes the very omniscience that doesn't exist. Logic demands we respect the gap between instinctual drives and rational ambition, using reason to refine rather than replace what has proven durable through time. Finally, freedom emerges as this incredibly delicate thing. A tender shoot that never springs from grand rational schemes but only through modest thinking, historical accidents, and fortunate organic development. It thrives where people allow rules to evolve gradually, as seen in those fortunate paths of incremental liberty rather than imposed constitutions. Trying to blueprint freedom is like trying to engineer a wildflower. The attempt kills the very spontaneity that makes it bloom. Counters insisting that strong central authority is required to protect freedom flip the script because authority-oriented approaches have consistently produced the opposite: stifled initiative and eventual tyranny. The reasoning is straightforward. Genuine liberty is the absence of coercive interference, not the product of a master plan, and it grows best where power remains dispersed and accountable through lived experience. Throughout these sections, a few powerful passages really hammer the points home. One that stands out captures the politician's stand with crystal clarity, showing how rejecting the welfare machine isn't selfishness but a defense of human dignity and real justice. Another drives home the illusion of victory over collectivist thinking, warning that unrecognized threats are the deadliest because they catch us unprepared. On the hubris of reason, the text lays out how constructivist dreams inevitably turn dystopian, not from bad actors but from the internal logic of the approach itself. The fragility of that tender freedom gets described in terms that make you feel the precariousness, how easily it's trampled by those who think they can improve on evolution. These aren't just rhetorical flourishes. They're logical anchors that tie every argument together. Stepping back, the themes here form a clear diagnosis. The West's troubles didn't start with economics or politics but with a philosophical mistake about the power and limits of human reason. When we treat society as a machine to be engineered rather than a living order to be nurtured, we invite exactly the kind of control and dependency that erodes everything worth preserving. The analysis holds because it rests on observable reality, dispersed knowledge, incentive structures, unintended consequences, rather than wishful abstractions. It challenges us to reclaim intellectual humility and defend the organic pathways that actually deliver prosperity and liberty. If this resonates with you, keep going with the next parts of the series where we see how these roots produce the planner's victories and the enduring myths around free markets. Grab a copy of the book, reflect on these foundations, and let's keep the conversation alive. Thanks for joining me on this journey. Until next time, stay curious and think critically. Stay free.